Well, Anson.
Good morning.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good.
Good.
How about you?
Oh, I'm doing well. How's your week been?
Pretty okay. To be honest, mostly handling most of my focus has been just handling, making medical appointments, and handling the details of that.
Yeah.
How about you?
Oh, not much. I've been busy with a lot of work. Jesse and I are preparing for the Neuromatch conference, which we'll talk about today. So
I am registered for that. It depends on my health on the day, but if I have energy, I definitely want to see the interesting. The workshop could interest me.
yeah, that's good. So Jesse said he log in with two devices. I don't know.
Log in on two devices.
Yeah, he's gonna log in on his iPad and his regular thing. But I don't know if he had trouble with that or not.
Is that for the purpose of presenting?
Yeah, from his iPad. So I've been thinking more about that thing that we talked about last week.
Yeah.
The project. And I have a couple of... I'm trying to create a couple of sort of deliverables or like goals for it. I went over it a little bit. Let's see if I can send you the... Oh, I can probably present my screen here. Okay. There we go. Oops, that's not it. So this is the MetaBrain Models project board. So Jesse's been putting a lot of things on here, and I have a couple things on here, and these are the two that I'm gonna point out. So this is the color space data set, and so this is the one where I just kind of make the... Oh, here's Jesse. Hello, Jesse.
Hello.
There he is. Good morning.
Sorry, late. Oh, okay. Later. How goes?
All right. Well.
Doing okay.
So I was just actually talking to Anson about this. So this is the MetaBrain Models board, and I see that Jesse has a lot of things on it. I might go over it later in the meeting. But this is the color space data set, which is issue 1. And then I split that up into two other things, number 12 and number 13. So, I mean, one way you can do this is walk you through like some of the things you might try to make this go from like a data set to this sort of platform, you know, something that would be useful for the project. So, let's see. Okay. So then there's issue 12. So the first one is... Oh, this isn't it. This is number 13 is the first one. Map RGB color space to a set of receptive fields. So the receptive fields would be distribution of RGB values centered on a portion of the space. So it would be like taking that color space and then turning it into a set of distributions, or like mapping it from one representation to another. So the RGB color space is one representation, and then we would turn it into another representation. I mean, I'd walk you through this. We'd have to work on it together, but that would be the first step. And then the second step would be to map those receptive field representations to an actual geometric structure. And so I think that would be the second step. That would be, again, something I'd walk you through. But that would be the sort of the way it would go. We'd have like we might walk through it in the meeting, in fact, just to be sort of maximally just you get the most out of it. And so we could all kind of participate in it, but we'd kind of walk through. I'd set it up. We'd walk through it, and then there'd probably be some things after the meeting that we could do during the week that would, or during several weeks that would facilitate the task.
Yeah, I'm sure I would benefit from that too, so I'm happy to walk through that or whatever.
Okay. Anson?
I said sounds good.
Okay, yeah. Good. Okay, so that's something we'll do in the next couple weeks. This week we're going to talk mostly about the Neuromatch presentations because that's this week. And Anson, of course, is registered, and Jesse and I are gonna present, and in the short sessions. So let's see. Why don't we bring up the Neuromatch website? I have it in here. Let me do this real quick. So this is the Neuromatch website, of course, and we have the agenda. So let's see what the agenda is. What's going on with the agenda here? They just put this together the other day, so there are a lot of good talks during the day, and it looks like they're using Crowdcast. So we talked about Crowdcast. So if you want to view talks that you can't make, you just go into Crowdcast, and they have the recordings in the Crowdcast interface. You can watch it, sort of catch up on it. They have the short talks, parallel sessions. Those I guess are in Crowdcast this year because they last time they had Zoom bombing problems, so they didn't want to repeat of that. Yeah, so this is the Crowdcast. Well, anyways, so our talks are, Jesse is signed up for Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. And that's...
Does it actually show them there now? Oh, I see.
No, but...
I see.
Oh, is that? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, this is my time, so it would be 6 p.m. So this is the short talks parallel. Oh, they're getting populated. Okay, so they don't have everything in there yet, but they'll be putting in talks. And, we'll have them in there. Then my talk is going to be Wednesday at... where is it? Oh, that was still Tuesday. Well, wait a minute. Did I get the right day? This is May 26th. This is Tuesday, right? Yeah, May 26th. I was in the wrong day, actually. So this is the short talks. Oh, there's Stefan. Hi, Stefan. We're just going over the Neuromatch stuff.
All right. Yeah, hi everyone.
Hi.
I'm glad to listen about it.
So,
all right.
Another person here. Okay, Amrendra. Hello, Amrendra. So we're going through this. So actually, I made a mistake. This is Jesse's. Okay, they still don't have them all up, but this is his session, 6 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're in India or Germany, you'd have to watch it later on Crowdcast. Then I'm giving a talk at 1 p.m. Eastern, and it's in this session. And it doesn't look like they have it programmed yet, but they'll put it all up. Again, if you want to, it's possible we might change times, but if you want to join in again, we can. You can watch it later on Crowdcast. So that's the initial schedule. It looks like there's a lot of good stuff. They're going to have debates. They're going to have some big names in different areas of neuroscience. There's a focus towards machine learning and deep learning and things like that. So it'll be pretty good. Future of Neuromatch. That'll be kind of interesting. They're going to talk about putting together a conference in a very short period of time. they have a data sharing panel, so that's kind of interesting because we have another initiative here called the Data Reuse Initiative, and this is interesting in light of that initiative. And then finally, there's Remembering Matt Taylor. So Matt Taylor was the community manager at Numenta, and he organized a lot of their community events. And he died suddenly in his sleep earlier this month, and so they're going to put on a commemoration of his work. Yeah, they have a pretty robust community presence at Numenta, so that should be interesting. He was interested in a lot of different things, so that's Neuromatch. If you can make it, it's asynchronous, so if you can't make those times, if they're in the middle of the night for you, you can watch them later on Crowdcast. So, all right, so Jesse, you wanted to go through your talk.
Yeah, I will probably, let's call this like a partial demo. It's not quite finished, but I think it'd be good to go through anyway.
Yeah.
And I think I set it up so I have 2 accounts now, and I will try to share my screen on the other one. How would I request to do that? Present my entire screen. Yeah. Okay.
I'll stop presenting actually.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
There we go.
Oh, all right. So, let's get the start of things. Basically, what I wanted to do with this presentation, it's not a lot of time, but it's kind of, I'm using it as practice to talk about all the stuff that's going into contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics, and I feel like contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics is essentially in a straight format. Obviously, for people who've been in the lab like Stefan and stuff, it's basically kind of combined the last couple of years of what's been going on in the lab, and that's we kind of know about that, or at least even if we didn't work on like contextual CGS stuff, contextual geometric structures. And that's one part I didn't quite get into yet with this, but it's basically combining the things, and I wouldn't be. I'm kind of talking this in the lab right now. I'm not really started the presentation, but it's sort of like for people who are in house, we know a lot of the context for it. For people who aren't in house, or for other people. There's a lot of context, and so learning how to talk about the context in a concise way is sort of the inception and the motivation behind this. Because how do you do this? It's like I'm personally interested in the concept of embodied cognition, but you could almost try to explain it without that concept, but I'm throwing it in there because I think it adds an important depth to what's going on. But at the same time, like sort of what is the raw deal about this? It's like, how do we group all these concepts together? So, and kind of explain the trajectory of the development of the ideas that's going on here. So, yes, I'd like to hide that. So, that's kind of this is kind of the overview of what I wanted to cover in it. And it's essentially presenting the objective of this, which I've sort of alluded to here in-house. But then, what is a brain review? What is representation? What is embodied cognition? What is contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics? And then sort of bring it all together. What are our aims and what tools and outcomes do we use for that? I'm kind of like 70% done with the presentation. so it's not parts are left out. But to go into what the objective of this presentation is, like, 10 minutes, 12 minutes isn't really a lot of time. So it's kind of like, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about, but it's sort of how do I do this in a very rough and ready way that kind of leads people to a place where they understand what it is. I mean, in one sense it's very simple, but in another sense, it's important to have certain context and background to it. So introducing the working concepts, explaining how they tie together into quote-unquote contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics, and what the motivation is for all of that. And this is a great thing that Bradly made. I believe it's housed in the repo itself, and in a lot of ways, this like, you could just reduce the presentation to this slide, because everything, like last year's project was about Brainberg vehicles, which are, as I learned more about representation and body cognition, it's like, okay, this is like the far end of the spectrum where there's basically no representation, and we're adding a representation layer on top of it. Great. This is not really. There's a bit of a lag here, but it's okay. Anyway, here's the abstract of the talk, but I'm not going to go through that here. I'm trying to condense all this stuff into a couple slides, but just to put it, just to show you it, or so you can look at it when it's paused later. So yeah, getting into it now. How do we actually address these concepts? I think, well, starting with a Brainberg vehicle. What is a Brainberg vehicle? We all know that here. Everybody's been in the lab before, but again, how do we start talking about this to outsiders or to people at Neuromatch? Valentino Brainberg is the man. Originally, they were thought experiments in this book, 1984, Vehicles, Developments in Synthetic Psychology. Very simple designs, and then I put appearance of in italics because it's complex behavior. Because it is complex behavior. This is on the left, on the right is some of the foundational vehicles you can have, depending, a very simple design of an organism with a simple body and a simple nervous system. You have a couple wheels and sensors, and tied to the wheel are the sensors. There's no complicated circuitry here, and it's just how things are wired depends on how it reacts to the stimulus. In this case, a very classic example is sunlight. Is it going to move towards sun, or is it going to be moving away from the sun when it picks it up in its sensors? And the gist of Brainberg's effort was, how do we have very simple thought experiments, and how do we look at some very basic mechanics, and those basic mechanics of interaction with environment affect the movement of a very simple organism or toy organism, and how does this affect behavior? And the really cool thing is that all of this is biologically inspired. The first half of the book is going through this development of the vehicles and adding a little bit on incrementally to the vehicles. The first vehicles are very simple, and they get more complex as they go. But on the right, you see, he directly spells out, okay, well, what are the virtues of cross connections? What does crossing connections have to do with it? And he goes further into how that affects, biological sight and left and right brain differences and things like that. So he ties it all together into a much more accessible way to look at what is happening. And I think it's at the forward of the book, like I started off by saying, Valentino Brainberg was a cybernetician, which is sort of this anachronistic term, and it gets into, okay, applied cybernetics is understanding how systems function, in this case the biological system, but it's also, quote unquote, communication and control in the animal and the machine, as Wiener said. Okay, that's a Brainberg vehicle. What is the developmental Brainberg vehicle? Well, that's sort of what we've done in the last year, and I will defer to people. I don't want to speak about their work, incorrectly. And I don't even have a lot to say here right now, but just saying developmental Bradenberg vehicles are essentially adding a little bit more stuff to this part of things. Like we've talked about, we have a lot of applications from like Hebbian learning and genetic algorithms and moving towards. I don't know if it was ever gotten to the point, but moving towards things like more and more deep learning and getting on the show it right, yeah. Like obviously Stefan's Rajan brain on the left, Ankit's on the right. You can see on the right there's sort of these almost like swarm behaviors of just massive amounts of vehicles as they go to stimulus and move. Maybe I could get an animated GIF of this up there. It isn't a big deal. And then looking at the genetic algorithm on the left and how that affects the interactions of the environment, and going very quickly through this for the time being. So developmental Bradenberg vehicles are adding much more, let's say, complex structure to the vehicle and its cognitive capacity, and not just a simple thought experiment. How could, in in sort of an agent-based way, how could we create an organism with these traits from Bradenberg vehicles, enhancing them with more, greater ability to model that stuff, and that was a large part of what happened last year. We wrote the paper on it, Bradenberg vehicles as developmental neurosimulation. So simulating how neurological structures could develop through interactions with the environment in a very simple way, but in an important way. And again, going back to this, the Bradenberg vehicles fall into the category of representation-free and I would say here why this is important is because it's important to consider how much representation is necessary for certain kinds of behavior, like basic toy models that original Bradenberg vehicles were, and even some of developmental Bradenberg vehicles. Essentially, they illustrate, okay, what kind of behavior can happen with almost no, that's essentially variations of input-output interaction. Like there isn't a lot of this contextual filtering going on. There isn't a lot of relationship to complicated representations. But there's still like the kind of behavior that's produced. Like there's obviously an intelligence to it. There's obviously complexity or complex seeming behaviors on very, very simple structures for an organism. Representation, what is it? And this is where I don't really know how to convey representation in a sense. I'll be refining this beforehand, but did I put it here? I don't know. Like, this isn't it. Like, I was considering using drawing from a lot of the language here about mental representations because I'm curious. I'm curious of how you would suggest I refer to representation in the context of what is adding the representational layer here, and how to communicate that simply to like the Neuromatch audience. Obviously, they know about representation, but in the context of my presentation, would I relate it to theory of mind, computational theory of mind, and sort of these, yeah. So I guess I'll say, how would you advise speaking about it in that sense?
I think, are you familiar with the "this is not a pipe" meme? Where they show a pipe and it says "this is not a pipe" underneath, and it's from a French Impressionist painting that is similar to that. But the idea is that the pipe is a representation of something else, and so "this is not a pipe" is written underneath as a way to kind of, it's juxtapose the two things, but to also bring the point that the pipe is used in the picture as a representation maybe of something else, not just a pipe. And so that's one shorthand you might consider. I would, in a 12-minute talk, I would recommend using, like, for very complex concepts. And I have this problem too. It's just like kind of an issue with that length of talk. You might want to think about using some shorthand that's really visual.
Yeah.
So, like,
absolutely.
you might also, like, say, you might show, like, taking one set of things and then showing the mapping to another set of things. I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe even like a globe to a flat map. I don't know if that's a very good example, but the idea is that basically you're representing one set of things with another set of things, and you're making that correspondence.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be, and I obviously don't have it yet. It's absolutely going to be visual, and I think the globe to the map thing is a good enough way to do it. And basically, what I want to convey is that the concept of representation is very important, and without I'm still a little bit unsure how to. I think what I'll do is just get a very simple visualization and refer to the concept in maybe its most broad capacity that I possibly can, and then go into talk about embodiment, because that's a little bit. I find personally speaking, I find the concept of embodiment just way more grounding and so much easier to reference stuff to. I mean, this is how it works for me. But this, embodied cognition is sort of a movement away from cognition as this purely representational, detached brain in the vat. It's just the mind. The mind itself is this entity that is the only factor in understanding the world around us. It's very mental, it's very cognitive, it's very removed from reality, it's very removed from, etc. And that the picture on the right is sort of this is from Anthony Cremera's Radical Embodied Cognition, and Cremera is sort of a champion of and I appreciate his book quite a bit, because he's not saying radical embodied cognition is the only way to think about embodied cognition. He's saying radical embodied cognition is an important perspective to have when we talk about cognitive science, when we talk about how organisms interact, when we talk about those things. And what is embodied cognition? What is radical embodied cognition? Radical embodied cognition, and I think I might even try to make a visualization tailored to this that is like a spectrum, because that's how I think about it. Like on the far end of the spectrum, let's say on the left side of the spectrum, you have radical embodied cognition, like the most radical, being representation free. And on the right, you might have very representation rich things, very, very symbolic things. And do you have different things along the middle? A very pure figure, version 2 break vehicle back in the first this interpretation is very much on the low representation, no representation free version of what where on the spectrum is it?
Yeah.
And so adding to this, we're adding a layer with more representational capacity on it. Depending, as a note, depending on how much it fits with the visualizations that I make, I might try to trace some of the lines in this image from Cremera's book, because they're very particular. The first split is between eliminativism and representationalism, and what does that really mean? And I could see myself going into that but this presentation kind of has to keep moving, and that's my point. Like I'm using this presentation. Yes, it's Neuromatch just as 12 minutes, but like I kind of want to have a 12-minute just wrap available to say, hey, here's what this is about. So this is practice for that, really. These are empty slides. So kind of wrapping it up in what I have left to present. Contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics. I'm basically quoting Bradly here. I think it's a very easy, nice way to say it. The brain vehicle consists of a body with sensors, very simple, representation free, and represents kind of the limbic system. Very, very important part of the body, and very important part of how we actually interact with the world, and affects our cognitive abilities and our behavior. That is kind of a base, and then adding this representational layer, and I will be adding a specific thing about what is contextual geometric structure. But it's essentially it's similar to the neocortex. Basically, it's similar to this layer that's stacked upon other things. And again, goes back to this diagram. Brain vehicles. This should be CGS. Contextual geometric structures equals contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics. And at the end, I was going to put some stuff about, I mentioned Net Logo. I mentioned some of the tools. I may mention some of the, list out some of the stuff that the previous summer project worked on for their like the software they use and stuff like that. Because I think it's good to kind of mention some of the resources and tools available, and then maybe wrap it up with a bow of like, this is important to study how adding, one of my, as I wrote sort of in my proposal and even the last two proposals, like my original proposal 2 years ago had to do with how do we toggle layers of cognitive ability, and in many ways this project is to have a representational layer available versus not having it available. That's sort of a massive, that's a massive difference, and looking at how much, what kind of behavior becomes more available as a representation happens. How does this, what my original proposal had to do with essentially interactions between agents, so multi-agent interaction, and how does representations affect the ability to do that? So I may sort of conclude with that as the aim that I may be looking into this summer. But that's kind of it for now. There's obviously, there's contextual geometric structures, there's representations, and there's a couple of visualizations I'd like to add to it. But the kind of ebb and flow of the presentations there. But I'm absolutely open to feedback or critique or things to add to this if anybody would like to suggest things.
Yeah. So anyone have any comments, questions?
I'm not sure how much to add, but I think it was interesting for me to see the overview in terms
I think it's really important for being able to just drop this on Anson or anybody coming to the lab. It's like, hey, here's what's actually going on. I feel like that's definitely a motivation behind it. So it's sort of a point of first contact for this stuff, and for trying to get a lot of the concepts that have been in the lab for a while.
If you only have 10 minutes, if you only have how long to present?
12 minutes.
If you only have 12 minutes, I keep it pretty snappy.
I kind of bleed it out in a lot of meta commentary on the presentation in the lab here, so it would absolutely not be it wouldn't look like it will here, I'll put it that way, but yeah. Like I plan on going through the brain bridge section like a couple minutes, and then very quickly on our paper, and then spending a little more time on representation and embodiment, and then kind of the bulk of it on, okay, embodiment towards what is it, presenting this concept of, okay, here's contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics as bringing this stuff together, and then what do we want to do with it, and how to do it a little bit, with the tools at least, so yeah.
Stefan or Amrendra, do you have any comments, questions?
So yeah, thanks Jesse. It was interesting. I guess it's a good presentation for an entry level on what is happening in Breitenberg needles and what could be built upon it, so to say. I think it was pretty well logically structured. So I like that.
Yeah, thanks. It's very, let's say, highly accessible. Is the aim.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
the more visualizations. I really want to get a visualization for representation and a visualization for. I don't know. I've been thinking about it for a while, but I think that the spectrum of representation would help. So I kind of defer.
Yeah, or maybe you could take some picture from the area of embedding. How about that? Like this thing it's widely spread across many disciplines, bioinformatics in particular, where you kind of try to narrow down the space of all available options by, well, kind of embedding them in a lower dimensional space. For instance, they do it with vectors for biological sequences. That's what I know. And maybe you could put a picture of it, like, some vector encoded values or maybe things that you want to represent and say, okay, that's maybe one possible way how we could represent things, just to illustrate the concept of representation.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the idea of a spectrum as well. I think that's good, to have it visual, sort of, it's like representation free and representation rich, and then what kind of sits in between them. It kind of, along with like a good sort of image of what representation is, like what you mean by it, then, it kind of brings it home. It's like, okay, here's representation, and then this is like, it's, representation is increasing. So, like, what does that mean? Does that mean that, like, you start with, like, just a network has no specification, and then you start to specify things? It really, I think, helps people think about, like, the possibilities, too.
I know that Camaro in his radical,
the book.
Radical Embodied Cognition book,
Right.
goes over that spectrum pretty explicitly, so that'd be good if we did want to go on that. But, I'm not sure how that could hear 12 minutes.
Yeah, and maybe I'll take some just very simple set of examples,
But if you did want to, like, I know he talks about, like, for example, like, emulation as one example of representation or non-representation. Yeah, but Anthony Camaro does like a lot of examples. So if you did want full examples, it would be a good source.
Yeah.
Like he even lists like fly anatomy.
Sorry, I think my internet cut out, but I heard about the flat anatomy and examples of that. So yes, I think that'd be good. That'd be good.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay, I was going to present what I have to present for this now, and let's see. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah. So actually, let me share my screen here. So very good job, Jesse. I'll be looking forward to seeing it in the wild, as they say, or at the conference. I think, though, it's, it doesn't have to be perfectly polished. It can be like, you'll see when I give this talk that it can be what, you want to be polished, but not like, if you have a loose end in terms of like thinking about something, you can just, kind of tell people that we're going to be developing this more. I got to think about this more. It helps people. It helps the flow of your presentation, so you don't have to go down this rabbit hole of trying to like figure out things in the talk about how it fits together. Just say that this is something. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it offline or something like that. And people might, take you up on that, but
yeah, I'm learning my science communication skills of how to navigate that, and dealing with like restricted windows of time, and being like having really high, like if you have high quality stuff that you can just easily is the nexus for a lot of ideas. That's ideal, because that way you can just refer to this simple representation of a lot of things. And
yeah.
So it's definitely its own art form. But, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of art forms, this is my presentation. Okay, so this is an idea that I've been working on for quite a while, but it is very sort of theoretical. So it's like it's like, again, one of these things where I've got a lot of images, I've got a lot of disparate data, but it isn't like there aren't a lot of hard and fast results. So this is computational virtuality as a form of artificial intelligence. So computational virtuality, what is that? That's the first thing we're going to talk about here. So we have to think about two big ideas here. And this has to do with people in virtual environments. And it could be animals too, but we'll only talk about people for right now. The first idea is that being virtual, and you see examples of people being virtual here, is an interplay between naturalistic human performance and novel experiences. So whether you're playing some sports simulation, or you're like, manipulating an avatar, or you're walking in a crowd of other virtual people, it's a novel experience, and there are things that are novel about interacting in that environment. But it's also naturalistic human performance. You're doing things like kicking a soccer ball or hitting a ball on a tee, or you're shooting at some target. You're doing something naturalistic. And, it's because in psychology, you usually do these experiments that are highly controlled. And this is sort of goes against that. But virtuality, and as I said, occurs in a lot of environments that you experience. You have to experience something called telepresence. So you have virtual reality or augmented reality or a movie, or even in a Zoom room, you can experience this virtuality. Experience is not the act of simulation itself, but activity of unspecified cognitive functions. We'll talk about those cognitive functions in a little bit. However, acts of simulation introduce stressors or perturbations to experience, which affects a host of cognitive systems. So that brings us to our second big idea, which is that the brain is an allostasis machine that differentiates. And what do I mean by that? Well, allostasis can be defined as the process by which the body responds to stressors in order to regain homeostasis. And homeostasis then is the process that maintains physiological systems within narrow operating ranges. So by extension, allostasis is maintaining this stability through altering physiologic parameters to counteract challenges. And so this is a concept that comes from stress and autonomic nervous system literature, but it's actually, I'm thinking about this in terms of cognition. So it's a little bit different, but this is an example of how allostasis works. You consider your allostatic state or your stress state as this dynamical system. And that's what this function is. And you have this red arrow is allostasis, this blue arrow is homeostatic recovery. So as you can see, your state of stress fluctuates over time, and the homeostatic recovery allows you to sort of regulate back to a set point. Allostasis is a sojourns away from equilibrium, and then if your allostatic load becomes sufficient, you end up at this new altered set point, which is basically a different state. And so this is important for probing this sort of allostatic capacity. And so then so this is an example of different things that happen in stress. You get all sorts of different complex states. So you get things like repeated hits of stress result in different complex states, prolonged stresses, lack of adaptation, and an inadequate response from your own body. They all lead to these macro states that are very complex and have a lot of dynamical consequences. So this leads us into a couple of aspects of virtuality which are important. One of these are cognitive gaps. So when you're in a virtual environment, you experience something called a cognitive gap. And this is the difference between your mental model of the world and the interactions with the world that you have, or the virtual world. These can be expressed as latencies and mismatches, but ultimately as a form of what we'll call dysregulation. So you can see that you can observe something and give feedback, and if the virtual world is novel enough from your normal world experience, this feedback becomes distorted or lagged or something like that. Furthermore, if you put force into an object, it should displace a certain amount of space in the real world. But in virtual worlds, you can modify this displacement so that it creates this dysregulative effect. So internal dysregulation is based on a couple of concepts of how we think about the brain. And it's very cybernetic. So this is the Cybernetics Cycle, which is the relationship between objects in the internal world. This is an older model, but it sort of goes back to it's sort of a lot of the origins of this idea of regulation and how we might also, we might think of cognition this way had cognitive science taken a different developmental trajectory. So if you disrupt this sensory motor feedback loop, it has consequences on adaptive behavior. And then we also have to mention the every good regulator theorem, which is every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And so that has to do with our internal model being a good model of the real world. And so if it's not a good model of the real world, then we have this internal dysregulation. And so in virtual worlds, you'll encounter things that are much different than your internal model of the actual naturalistic world. So for example, if you're playing a game in a virtual environment, you might encounter things that are sort of dysregulative, or when you talk to someone on a Zoom call, you experience lags and things that might be dysregulative. And this is an attempt to sort of characterize that in a systems manner. And so this is more about the internal model. So and this is a sensory motor behavior. And we can see how the body the body and the movement system is coordinated using these internal models. They've developed different internal models for the cerebellum and other areas of the brain. And it allows us to coordinate our behavior very exquisitely. But these models can also be perturbed into a dysregulated state. And so I don't show that here, but we can do things that dysregulate these models. But we can also do things like decouple sensory streams. So it turns out that when you decouple sensory modalities such as vision or touch or audition, when you make them non-coincident in space and time, you can also get these dysregulative events. You might also call them sensory disarticulation events, and they interfere with the natural sort of integration of stimuli from different senses. So this is the first pass at a virtuality network. This is something that I recently published in a book chapter. This is, again, it's a very embodied model of virtuality, so it involves both the brain and the body itself outside the central nervous system. And you can see that there are a lot of very fuzzy concepts here, like self-awareness, vision, attention, audition. Now with these, we know what the neural substrates are. With self-awareness, it's less clear. But these are basically the quantities that we're talking about. So in this paper, we talk. It's called Natural Supervised Learning and Manipulable Technologies. So it was an attempt to sort of characterize an early attempt to characterize some of this using virtual environments and different devices that would induce this dysregulative state. So basically the idea here is that the physics of the environment that you have in front of you, the forces that you encounter from feedback with surfaces, the light that you have that you see by, act to supervise the nervous system. So it acts to supervise things like plasticity and learning. When these cues are removed or decoupled, so when the cues of your physical environment are decoupled or removed, and this often happens in a virtual setting, it creates a cognitive gap. And so we can actually kind of exploit this or, sort of induce this through experimental design. And so one of the paradigms we use for this is learn, unlearn, and relearn, which is where you learn something, you have some interference in that learning, and then you relearn the thing, you get reintroduced to the learning stimulus, and it affects your performance in some way. And so this is an example of stimulus switching in an environment where we have introduced different types of surfaces, and we're measuring the EMG of a subject who's interacting with these surfaces. And it's a pretty messy looking trace, but you can see the traces vary by different, with different surfaces. But this is sort of the type of thing that we have to sort of analyze. So some of these are very similar and some of these are different. And it's a little hard to understand from this graph because it confounds surface type with, the surface types are classified, but it's a little hard to see because you confound the surface type with the learning interference. But that's, suffice it to say, it has differential effects across different types of designs or different types of stimuli. So then we can also model this using computational agents. I think using human subjects is rather limited, but you have computational agents you can use as well. So what we'll do in the case of a computational agent is we'll take the basic functions of a nervous system and distill them into a series of functions. These functions can be regulated or dysregulated using various forms of perturbation. And then what is the universal basis for virtuality in an embodied nervous system? Well, we don't know. We don't want to use necessarily realistic models of brain regions. We want to capture some of these processes going on of change. And so our agent architecture involves attentional attributes like integrate and adjacency. So these have to do with how you're integrating information from different senses, how to associate things from different contexts. But you also have sensory motor attributes. So you look at things like displacement and tracking and sampling of the environment. And we have a couple of examples. One is from something called morphogenetic agents, where you have one agent that's emitting a pattern and one agent that's observing and reconstructing that pattern. And this allows for this sort of coevolutionary relationship to exist between the two that allow for learning and training of the model. And the reason we might use morphogenetic agents is because we can create intentionally disruptive morphogenetic patterns that confound the observer, and the observer has to find a way to learn that those patterns are maybe, out of distribution, or that they connect to other patterns. And so that's one approach that we could use. And then this is an example of morphogenetic agents using attention to learn things. Another one is to use modified Bradenberg vehicles. So instead of Bradenberg vehicles, the way they're generally used in terms of following phototaxis, we can use physics engine functions such as force feedback or gravity, which are intentionally implausible. And so we can use incongruous physics simulations to train embodied neural networks or genetic algorithms as well. But we can use those simulations to induce this sort of dysregulation internally. And this connects, of course, to intelligence augmentation, which is an old concept. This is where you're amplifying intelligence based on some, set of criterion. The idea is that this dysregulation ultimately allows us to amplify the intelligence of the agent. And then finally, this relates to cognitive gaps in development. So this is a hard graph to explain in a very short period of time, but it basically has to do with how flies avoid the predatory swatter. That flies' visual sampling is much higher than humans' visual sampling, and so they can detect, movement a lot quicker than humans can. And so the idea is that the humans are planning more than they're sampling their environment. Flies are sampling more than they're planning in their environment, and they exist in this trade-off. And so the flies down here are able to avoid the swatter. And if you actually, in virtual environments, you might be able to induce this relativistic regime where this trade-off breaks down, but we don't know that. And so thank you for your attention. And that's the end of the slides, and I would basically, kind of go into questions. And I have to, I think I'm going to have to cut a couple slides, but I'm not sure yet.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I know it's very, excuse me, very interesting. I know, I've been curious about a lot of the stuff that you've done before with virtual reality, and I think it's really cool to see all the things tied into that. Like a lot of stuff, a lot of the concepts in there. I know that's something that's been in the lab before, like I've seen in the past, but I was like, I'm curious. I'm very curious about a lot of that stuff, I'll say.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot to pack into one presentation. I'll probably cut some of it, but I'll have the slides, that's the other thing you can do is hide slides like we did with the CSV presentation. You can hide certain slides if you think they're a little bit much, and then move on to other things, and then you can put your slides up on Figshare, to distribute them to people so that they can see the whole thing.
I'll be honest and say I didn't entirely follow along technically, but I found it really interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff to throw at people in that short amount of time. It's kind of like it's something that when we were doing a lot of virtual reality research was hard, and this was years ago. It was hard for people to really kind of figure out what was going on because they didn't really have the context. It was like, well, how are you doing this part of the experiment? And then you have to explain it, and people still didn't get it because it was really outside of the typical experimental experience. But yeah, there is a lot of information in there.
So the idea is I might be really off, and so I'm kind of afraid of embarrassing myself. But the idea that you're altering virtual spaces, alter expectations of standard sensory experiences compared to so such that our homeostatic preferences, I think it's homeostatic set points change, and our processing model is changed. So
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea is that you have these virtual worlds and they're unique in a lot of ways. And so when you encounter them, it shifts you away from your sort of set point for different phenomena. So, it's like if you experience movement or motion or proprioception in a certain way, and you're in a virtual environment and you experience it differently, but you're doing very similar types of tasks, it's sort of disorienting. But this disorientation is actually something that will change your ability, like change your sort of allostatic set or your homeostatic set point through allostasis. It shifts it in that way, and then that will lead to other things. It could be like it could affect learning, it could enhance learning, it could be like it could be disruptive to your learning abilities.
I think an interesting example could be I don't have a specific, but like I saw on Facebook someone was posting about how it's normal to feel that not feel socially satisfied through all this all the Skype and Zoom calls because there's like a displacement between your expectations, your body. You have to process your body's having to process the visual screen and your normal expectations. There's the allostatic. I think I actually did mention allostatic difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mention you guys an example, like you guys might be experiencing this through all the Zoom calls and Skype calls because I think that might be a way to personally relatable and be like, oh, okay, that clicks.
Yeah.
Like making reality accessible to people.
Yeah. I think that there's a literature like on presence in like social presence and things like that. That's they I don't know how much they talk about like allostasis and homeostasis, but the idea is basically there that that there's some difference in how you experience the world when they communicate through some virtual world versus a real world thing, whatever that means. And so it's there's that difference, presence meaning that you feel like you're in the real world. But, more generally, it's like there's this displacement of between like a virtual world and the real experience. And so it's very hard to quantify experience or to get like a good sense of what a real experience or virtual experience is. It's very hard to like pin that down and say that there's a quantitative amount that, difference, but we know that it exists.
And I'm sure that if you like raised like the next generation grows up, it's like Skyping all their friends 24/7. I'm sure that like that's normal for them. That's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any other, like, Stefan or Amrendra, do you have any comments? Okay.
It's a little abstract, but just do have a tangent. I'm just curious. So is virtuality just kind of defined as the constructed sensory experience then?
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Yeah, that was just like a little curiosity. It's not important.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have really anything specific at the moment. Yeah, I would maybe revisit slides as well. Would you put them online somehow, or?
Oh yeah, I can put them in the Slack channel. I can share them.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good.
Okay. Yeah, and then thanks. So we'll be Jesse and I again will be presenting like Tuesday and Wednesday I'll be probably working on like modifying talks till the time of the talk, and then we'll make the slides available. I can make them available in Slack, and then like the final version we can put on Figshare, and then I can share them in Slack. For people when they attend the talk and they want to see more. And then that hopefully it'll go well. So good luck. Let me think. Do we have anything else we need to talk about? A little bit past the top of the hour.
I think either today or tomorrow I'm going to finish my slides and probably go over them with you in Slack. Because I want to flesh out particularly the representation image. As far as other stuff goes, I kind of went overkill with the board thing, but it's actually not a bad way for me to think about stuff, because I've been doing a lot of my own organizational work on how to manage. I've gotten into Notion, the app Notion, which is like a relational database. Like you can create a bunch of stuff that I've been using that quite a bit to try to manage all of my things, and so putting it on the GitHub project tracker again is helpful. I'm there now, actually. Is there anything?
Oh, this is on MetaBrain.
The board.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess my question would be: is there anything we should focus on for next week? Like, I know I put something up there about the blog posts, but obviously that's not urgent, but at the same time I might try to just write stuff down, because each week that goes away from those conferences I'm just further out from my mental space.
Yeah. Oh, let's mention the Devo, or the Developmental Neural Networks workshop. So there's a potential opportunity at the Artificial Life Conference to maybe submit something on developmental neural networks. So we have this stuff on developmental Bradenberg vehicles that we can recycle for this. They're looking for extended abstracts. They're about 2 to 3 pages, and it's due, I think, June. I can't remember what the date is. It's not for another couple weeks, but I think that would be a good opportunity to submit something. So why don't people, if they want to participate, express interest in Slack, offline, via email, however you want to do it. But just let me know if you want to contribute. I don't know what the submission will look like. Maybe we can talk about it next week. In terms of attending the conference, it's virtual. There is a registration fee, and I'm not sure how that can be navigated. But we'll deal with that when the time comes. We'll see how that goes. But I think it's worth at least submitting something, and then if we don't get accepted, or if we can't make the conference, then we can use it for something else. But I think it's a good sort of developmental tool at the very least.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I ran into Josh Bogard, who does a lot with like evolutionary robotics. He's doing, I don't know, that's not his workshop. I think it's an adjacent one.
Yeah.
Or is it? Is he doing that one? I forget.
I don't think so.
But he's doing something similar that was quite interesting. I have yet to, but on my to-do list of things, like he has a really cool evolutionary robotics like online course. It's all like on Reddit and stuff like that. And I've been wanting to do more with him for a little bit, so that's cool. Even like at the Vermont Complex Systems Institute is a nice group, and I've done so much stuff adjacent to them, and I live very close relatively to them, so it keeps coming up. But I think just other than the board, I think the applications for all the Neuromatch stuff is done. Like I submitted. Oh, round 2. I don't know if Anson is doing the intensive track or not. I forget. But I was applying to that, and round 2 is like due. The student round 2 application is due, I think, the 25th. So it'll be good to finish that. anybody who still wants to do that.
This is for Neuromatch Academy.
Neuromatch Academy, yeah. There's a second round of the student things, and I know I'm going to probably try to do the intensive track, given that I should have time to do it, which is like really involved coursework and mentoring and all that stuff. But that's due, so I'm sure everybody does that. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all the stuff I put on there. I totally went. I never used labels on this board before, or whatever. So it's kind of I don't know if I'm going to do that in the future, but
I think it's useful if you have a lot of issues, but
yeah.
But yeah, we'll talk about that next week. I think. I don't see anything that's like imminent. Again, we'll talk about the color space data set more next week. Kind of like like I said, we'll go through like the two main steps, walk through them, and Anson. I think it'll benefit Jesse as well. But I think it's otherwise. It's like Anson. I don't know if like I don't want to like have him go down a bunch of blind alleys with things and like trying to understand something, and then I trying to understand something, and then I think it's always good to have like these working groups where you can like go and kind of walk through it, and then everyone learns something.
Yeah, I'm definitely for that. Is there anything that I should have ready for next week? I guess is a specific question. I know we'll probably go over Neuromatch stuff again, but I'm just trying to. I feel like there's something that I'm missing, but I'm not sure what it is.
I think for next week, just if you want to do a recap of the conference, that's good. I mean, that would be probably sufficient. And just recap, meaning like your experiences, and we might talk a little bit about like how it went, which is good. It's always good to
okay.
Yeah. So.
Just a very quick mention. I am doing the Complexity Explorer hackathon thing, which is the first little bit was like super nebulous, and it's like what, like I don't know how we're going to be able to focus on anything, but I've seen to find people that want to do stuff regarding maybe misinformation and tech and data ethics sort of related stuff and applying some maybe towards machine learning or different like agent-based modeling towards that, which is pretty cool. So maybe I'll give an update on that if anything comes from it. It's an interesting group of people, and so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Any last minute comments?
That's all for me.
Alright. If not, Greg or Stefan, did you get your letter of recommendation that I sent you? I sent it to you earlier this week.
Yeah, it's somehow slow.
Okay.
Connection on my phone is a little bit slow. Yeah, I did totally, and thank you very much for this one.
Okay, yeah. No problem.
Yeah, I guess they will really like it.
Okay.
So thank you.
All right, good luck with that. Yeah, it looks
Thanks.
pretty good.
Yeah.
So, all right, if that's it for this week, we're pretty far over the top of the hour, but that's okay. Next week we'll discuss more stuff, and if you want to talk offline, we'll see you at Neuromatch. If you want to discuss things offline, let me know by Slack or email. Have a good week.
All right, take care, everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.